I'm very happy to finally have Latin on board on a live stream. So welcome to you, and also welcome John. Um, how are you doing, Latin? Can we get a sound check from you, Latin?
I think I'm good now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, I'm doing pretty good. Thanks, Erlen. And it's been an interesting week, maybe a couple of weeks, of connecting some dots between statements that have been made by Ukrainian leadership that I think helps us to look at some of what they might be looking at, hoping for in combat aviation in 2024.
Yeah. So I can unfortunately hear a little bit of feedback. So if you mute between when you speak and not. Okay, perfect. Yeah. So you basically wanted to talk about this statement from Mykola Oleshuk, which you thought was very interesting. Um, he wanted to talk about some new aircraft for Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it?
So, Erlen, is it okay if we kind of look at it big picture, just take a little step back from that particular comment? Is that okay if we go there?
Of course.
Um, because I had, and that statement by the commander of the Ukrainian Air Force had been touched on last week in the space where I was listening, and I think it had only been a few days before. So during the week, I was listening to a podcast which mentioned some of the comments that President Zelensky had made at Davos. It's a series of three comments that are President Zelensky and the commander of the ground forces and the air force, and they're all within a few days of each other. So I think it's safe to say that there's some common messaging happening there. And when I when I listened to it and then looked up the transcript, he made a point of mentioning air superiority. Now, hopefully, my phone doesn't crash here, but I want to read it as it appeared in the. Okay, so let's see if this works. It was one paragraph that he dedicated to this subject, having spoken about some of what they've been able to accomplish in the Black Sea. And he said, "We must gain air superiority for Ukraine, just as we have gained superiority at the Black Sea. We can do it. Partners know what's needed and in what quantities. This will allow progress on the ground." Sorry. Let me head back to. So there he is. You got a picture of him there. So he seems to be referencing the comments that were made by. Sorry if my Ukrainian ranks are incorrect, but I believe it's in the Western equivalent. It would be or in Canada, Lieutenant General Syrski, the commander of the ground forces, where he had made. I believe he might have been the first who made a statement about how air power was going to be that he needed air power to play a role in moving the situation on the ground, and that's where he had specifically mentioned A-10s. And then around that time, then President Zelensky made his comments, and then the commander of the Air Force, General Oleshchuk, had made the comments where, I think I don't want to get too bogged down on the two aircraft types that he mentioned, which were Mirage 2000 and A-10, but because I think that all of the general statement that he made, and it was a fairly well crafted and long statement on Telegram. In other words, I don't think it was like an accident or a misspeak or something that his staff may have. I don't think it was a miscommunication. I think it was intentional, deliberate, and he is talking kind of big picture, including mentioning his colleagues in Army aviation. I thought that was interesting that he mentioned the situation they're in and how they are also going to need to upgrade to Western equipment. But he mentioned specifically what General Syrski of the ground forces had said, kind of saying that he understood those needs and he understood that the Air Force had a role to play in being able to better support the ground forces. So all of this, I think, points us to what seems to be at the highest levels of Ukrainian military and civilian leadership, a vision that they seem to have for what they hope will happen with their partners' help in 2024. And I think probably a good starting point would be to have a really good look at, and maybe look at what President Zelensky meant by air superiority. I think it's fair to say, because that's the term he used in Davos, and I think it's fair to say that that probably is he's not referring to strictly doctrinal air superiority as U.S. Air Force staff would understand it. That it's something else. It's something uniquely Ukrainian, because we know that they don't have, nor will they possibly, conceivably, in 2024, have all of the assets, not to mention training and experience, to make air superiority happen the way a Western force would understand it. So maybe we can start with that kind of 30,000 foot view of what the President Zelensky may have meant by air superiority in the Ukrainian context.
Yeah, and I just wonder, do you think that these statements reflect more or less also the long term determination and planning that these military leaders are actually working on when they sit down and discuss, not just with Western military leaders, but also when they're internally basically writing out the plans for how they see their air force and army aviation in the future.
They must clearly understand the limitations. They've had enough contact over the years with Western militaries, Western air forces in particular, to have a basic understanding of how air superiority works in the West. And I think that if President Zelensky is mentioning air superiority, there has to be a understanding of what that will look uniquely Ukrainian, especially early on. Down the road, yes, years, decades down the roads when capabilities are built up, then that's a different situation. But in 2024, they're clearly looking at some additional capabilities. They're clearly looking at, and I would reference General Oleshchuk, the commander of the Air Force, his statement, which was the most specific of the three, where there seems to be, strictly on the equipment side, there seems to be a vision that involves the already committed F-16s from Europe, supplementing and eventually replacing the Su-27 and Su-20, or correction, MiG-29 forces, the fighter force. By the way, while that picture that I'm looking at right now is up, that was a picture that was released on Telegram just a few days ago. Interesting because of the shark mouth, which is not extremely common in the Ukrainian Air Force. But I can't help but say that the first thing I noticed when I looked at this picture was the obviously rough appearance of this aircraft. That, of course, does not mean that it's not fully operational, that it can't do its job, but it does. I mean, for me, anyways, and others can disagree, but it does. I've seen a few images like this over the last few months of different aircraft types, and we know that they've been pulling airframes that were retired after 2014, that had even in some cases seen combat in 2014. These are some very well worn airframes, and there's probably some very serious questions about the status of not just their fighter force, but of their other fixed wing types. So, to at least begin the process of augmenting that force, the fighter force, with F-16s, that seems to be the first part of this. And then he clearly identifies the need to begin that same process for the tactical strike force, or the close support force, which is Su-25s, and the Su-24s in the more long range or heavier strike role. Similar situation, right? In those with those aircraft is what you would be seeing with what you saw in that image there with that MiG-29 looking pretty worn and opening questions about the overall state of their combat force. So there may be an immediate need, or something with a sense of urgency about getting moving on that process of swapping out these Soviet era aircraft. The bigger picture is also the need to plug into the Western system, Western logistics, Western weaponry. And also, I think, slightly bigger picture even is like zooming out even a little more, maybe potential involvement of Ukrainian industry in partnerships with Western partners, because that is also something they've got to be looking at now, because that's the part of it that points us towards greater self-sufficiency, which, given the political situation that we've been seeing over the last little while, has got to be something that all Ukrainian planners, certainly their air staff, have got to be thinking about. If there was a time that they thought the F-16 would be able to be the backbone of their future Western combat force, fixed wing force, I feel pretty safe in saying that it's just my impression that they're probably revisiting that, given what we've seen happening in the U.S. Because it doesn't take much to figure out that that could set them up for a catastrophic situation down the road. So the fact that I'm not so much interested in this moment right now in arguing the merits of A10 or Mirage 2000D, but the fact that he mentioned them specifically, I think, was a signaling of the fact that they are open to, at the very least, or maybe actively reviewing the idea of putting.
Oh, I think we lost Latin there. Well, while he is attempting to reconnect, John, I know that you've been very adamant about the fact that Ukraine should focus solely on F-16s for their new air force that they're hopefully going to build in the coming years. But as the political picture in the U.S. seems more and more unpredictable and unstable, at least from the Ukrainian point of view. Do you agree that exploring these other alternatives is necessary for Ukraine?
There certainly isn't harm in it. There's a lot of practical hurdles, though, for most of the F-16 alternatives. The modern alternatives being Gripen, Eurofighter, and Rafale. They each have their own nuances and hurdles that I think would make it challenging for Ukraine to operate in well, first to acquire and then operationalize at a meaningful scale that isn't more than a handful of airframes. And that's partially why I'm very much adamant on the focus should be on a unified fleet of F-16s, perhaps, 10 years down the line, diversification into F-15s or F-35s, depending on what this, economic situation looks like there and what the relevant capability gaps are that need to be closed at that point. But in the interim, there's a lot of hurdles to aircraft that are not F-16s, both in terms of what the countries that manufacture those aircraft are financially willing to support. Take for example Mirage, which isn't I guess it's a little bit outside this, but I mean for both Mirage and Rafale, I mean if you just take a look at the financial commitment that France has made to Ukraine thus far, I don't think the level of financial commitment they've demonstrated thus far in my mind, is not commiserate with the level of commitment that would be needed to supply a substantive number of fixed wing platforms and then provide the robust sustainment infrastructure for it. And that's in and of itself is an inherent problem with any of the French options. Sustainment's going to be a challenge for them. It's a challenge for everybody that operates French airframes. Even though the aircraft themselves are quite good. So I'm just enormously skeptical on that front. With regard to Sweden, again, there's not that many Gripens out there. Production capacity is pretty tiny. It's just something that I'm skeptical would be available in any large, meaningful quantity. And again, while Gripen is certainly an easier airframe to maintain and sustain than many of the other alternatives, including arguably the F-16, there's the question of can Sweden both financially and practically provide the level of robust sustainment infrastructure that could come with the F-16s? And I think the answer there is very uncertain. And then finally, that leaves Typhoon, Eurofighter. Again, any export of that aircraft to Ukraine, there's going to be a lot of hurdles there because it's going to require export authorization from multiple countries, UK, Germany. etc. It's a hideously expensive aircraft for the capability. And again, it doesn't, the major operators of that airframe have seemed pretty committed to not providing any to Ukraine thus far. Germany has completely ruled it out. The RAF, it really isn't in a position to provide Typhoons. I just don't see a particularly viable path for the F-16 alternatives as it stands. I mean, I think the most plausible would be that Ukraine gets 6 to 12 Gripens, 50% operational availability rate. They have 3 to 6 flying at any time. I suspect that would probably be the most likely non F-16 outcome that we see, at least for the next couple of years.
But yeah, when we're talking about numbers here, what does Ukraine need to aim for when it comes to, let's say, the next 1 year to 2 years of war planning? Because their fleet has a certain number of hours already on the back, and it seems like there is quite an urgent need to replace some of those airframes. Latin, how do you see the next year and 2 3 years for the Ukrainian Air Force developing, and what the options are when it comes to the number of aircrafts?
Well, I agree with everything John was just saying. I managed to come back and hear most of that. And I do agree that Eurofighter is, there's no indication that it's even on the radar. It's just a non issue at this point. At least with some of the other types, they've been discussed or at least mentioned officially now. So we can at least consider them a blip on the radar screen. But the long term, you got this long term goal of a westernized Ukrainian Air Force, which would probably have somewhere between 200 and 300 fixed wing combat aircraft, and where we are now. That's a very big gap. And I don't see anything happening in 2024 that would be beyond the kind of scenario that John just mentioned. Like at best, the swapping out of one squadron within a Ukrainian fighter brigade. So you're talking about 12 aircraft roughly. And it may even be an understrength squadron. I just can't see that anything else could happen. The only thing I'll add to what you were saying, John, is that if we look at a potential, some of the potential donations that you were talking about, I kind of see it in two parts. I would break it down into two parts. If we put the onus on the country that operates and produces an aircraft, and that may be in a position to provide some surplus airframes short term, I think that is much more likely that it could happen with, well, you mentioned Sweden, but I do think it is also possible with France. Thinking of it from that nation's arms industry point of view and political point of view, it's a stopgap. Even if the numbers aren't ideal, even if there's limits to what Ukraine would be able to absorb, especially when you're introducing different types, as you were saying, which really complicates the picture. It's a stopgap that could allow for some increase in capabilities, leading to down the road a provision of something more advanced, probably new production. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that you ask Dassault or Saab what they think of this, and I think that's what the scenario would be. As far as different types, I mean, it's obviously it's less than optimal, but my question is, what are the alternatives given the current political situation, particularly in the U.S., understanding that could easily be France tomorrow if Marine Le Pen is elected. So what is the alternative? It just seems to me, based on past experience with countries like, quick example off the top of my head, Indonesia or India, is to somewhat protect themselves against those kind of scenarios, but exactly by creating a diverse fleet. You pay a price, literally you pay a price in training, in operational costs, in order to create a force that is somewhat protected from sanctions, from the political whims of partner nations. I just don't see what the alternative is right now. And they have to be thinking of that, because the U.S. situation, as from my perspective as a Canadian, looks pretty serious right now.
I mean, I would think that there, if we're just talking acquiring additional numbers of airframes in an absolute sense, I would say that the focus should be on getting Belgium to cough up its 40 odd or so F-16s they're currently refusing to part with for very contrived and nonsensical reasons. But more specifically to your point about alternatives, you're right. There is a value in having a hedge against changing political circumstances by operating airframes from different vendors from different countries. But that kind of comes back to the underlying issue, at least in my mind, that while it would be beneficial to have some level of insulation, the question is at what scale and what relative scale. It's one thing to say, we're going to have these 12 Gripens. That is a level of insulation that's not that decouples part of their air force from the domestic body politic here in the U.S. But at the same time, that's only 12 Gripens, and then they're pledged to get 60 something. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head. F-16s from Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, potentially more. Belgium, chimes in. It's just such a small portion of the force that, while again it does give you some insulation, it doesn't give you that much. And I'm just, in my mind, I'm not sure that potentially some inefficient resource expenditure that would be necessary to pursue that. I'm not necessarily sure that trade-off is worth it. Is my calculus.
Ladin, do you have a response to John there, or
Yeah, totally agree. And these are the questions that um, air staff in Ukraine are dealing with, along with their um, with political leadership. I mean, that's exactly what they're dealing with right now, is making those decisions of um, uh, gaining in some areas and potential costs. But what I think I'm safe in saying, and we probably all, it sounds like we probably all agree on this. Anybody who has even casual is a casual observer of Ukrainian military aviation has to be questioning, and occasionally I think we do see some little glimpses of visual evidence of the just how stretched their fixed wing combat fleet must be at this point, notwithstanding what are more than likely absolutely heroic efforts by their ground crews to maintain what they have. It's We're definitely at a point where things are probably getting pretty difficult. So again, a sense of urgency is probably starting to drive some of these decisions.
when it comes to maintaining old aircrafts, I'm really not an expert at this at all. But I've understood that there's basically a limit to how many hours you can safely fly these airframes. But how much can good maintenance and ingenuity on the Ukrainian logistics and maintenance side, how much can that extend the lifeline of these Soviet legacy aircraft? Because I understand there's a limit.
Well, limits are set on every type in the world that flies, and they're pretty conservative for the most part. I think those limits have probably been pushed way past, by the book uh, limits by the Ukrainians. But at the end of the day, it's catastrophic failure that will determine how far you can go. Hopefully, that catastrophic failure is detected on the ground in an inspection where um, key members of the airframe are when you begin to detect cracks. Um, or sadly, and there is evidence of this, our friend Alex had mentioned some of this. I believe it was last year that there may have been at least one incident of a Ukrainian MiG-29 that literally broke apart in the air. That wouldn't surprise me at all if that had been the case, and if it's happened in other occasions. So I think they're probably past that point of the doing it by the book, and they're doing what they can with what they have and taking the risk that there may be catastrophic failures, unfortunately, sometimes in the air.
So what really tempts me about the Swedish option is that the probably Saab and the Swedish government would be very interested in platforming their airplanes in another country for the future of the whole Swedish aviation industry. And when it comes to logistical support, I'm actually not that worried. I think Sweden can probably, if they want, back Ukraine at least for a while. Um, how would that also be with F-16s? Is one of the things that I'm thinking in my head. Like, isn't parts availability also an issue for the F-16 fleet when it comes to the Gripens? At least that's produced in Europe, while I don't think there's a lot of availability in Europe when it comes to F-16s, part other than the airframes that are operational.
With F-16, I mean, ultimately the producing nation. So the U.S. has a lot of say in trying to hinder F-16 operations in the future, if they wanted to, if a certain administration wanted to do that. That said, we could look at the example of Venezuela that has experienced all sorts of restrictions from the U.S. and their F-16s. It's a small force. It's not a huge number of F-16s they have, but they continue operational. At least a handful of them, we know from recent video, are still operational. So there's always that risk. You know, with Gripen, I think it's a really interestingly placed aircraft in that it's kind of, well, well, there's the ASA radar right there. There's the image. So this is the upgrade to the PS-05A that they were test flying it, I think, around 2020. It really does transform its capabilities, and it is offered off the shelf as an upgrade to existing Gripen C and D operators. I believe Thailand is already going ahead with that. By the way, speaking of Thailand, this is kind of a side note, but it has potential. It was just a little data point that I found digging around a few days ago, and I thought it was interesting in the Ukrainian context. So I read in Air International online that there was a report a few years ago, I think it was around 2016, thereabouts, that was leaked from the People's Liberation Army Air Force, Chinese Air Force, that after doing a series of exercises with the Royal Thai Air Force flying the Gripen C and D, that the Chinese flanker pilots, the Su-27 pilots, and these are first generation Su-27s, so different from the ones that the Russians are flying right now, at least most of them. But these PLAAF pilots were saying that they were getting detected by the Thai Gripens at distances of 160 kilometers, and that in beyond visual range engagements, the Gripens were coming on top about 80% of those engagements. Now I was trying to figure out, and I haven't found a specific information on which radar the Thai Gripen C's and D's were delivered with. It's definitely not the ASA upgrade. It may be the Mark III or the Mark IV, which are still mechanically scanned, but all of these are basically variants of the same basic Saab radar, the PS-05A, but they do have this ASA upgrade. And we pretty much know that the Ukrainians have been pushing for some kind of radar upgrade to the F-16s. I would be very surprised if they didn't have those same discussions with the Swedes about Gripen. So and also it's, even though it's if you add the ASA radar to it, then you're talking really about a 4+ generation aircraft. And like Eurofighter, even though it's not specifically built to be low observable, or 5th gen, let's call it, as it's often referred to, it does have a very low radar signature. And that was another area where apparently the PLAAF pilots were having trouble seeing it. So I do think it really is a real contender. Now, of course, the other piece of information in the last few days is the Sweden's accession to NATO. Apparently, unless someone has information I don't have, it looks as though they've passed the last hurdle, with President Erdogan giving it the okay, and they have made it contingent. The Swedes have made any delivery of Gripens contingent on NATO membership, which I think is at least partly to do with potential backfill of their air defense capabilities from allied nations. so yeah, but I don't think, getting back to what we're probably going to see in the next few years, and what, or correction, not the next few years, the next few months, and what the Ukrainians probably are hoping for, it's going to be relatively small numbers of some of these types. Absolutely agree with John's assertion that any more F-16s that could be brought out of NATO inventory would be helpful. I got to think the Ukraine. I mean, it's important to remember that General Oleshchuk's comments didn't just say that they're looking at other options. It did make it clear that their priority is still the F-16. Now, how much of that was signaling to the Americans? I'm not sure that the MAGA people in the U.S. Congress really could care less whether Ukraine gets Gripens or Mirage 2000Ds, but maybe part of it was signaling to American lawmakers that they still, that maybe that's still their preferred option, is to move forward with F-16. Whether they have made the decision that going forward a strictly F-16 force may not be the way to go, we don't know that. There's no indication of that. But his comments, General Oleshchuk's comments, definitely point us in the direction of other possibilities that they're looking at.
John, I see you answering some stuff in chat. Is there anything relevant that you maybe wanted to address while we've got on the topic?
Well, most of the questions in chat were sort of ancillary, just some discussion about the number of specific F-16s and whether or not the Netherlands would be able to provide their full inventory of 42 due to airframe life considerations. Just one thing I would like to add, sort of that we touched on earlier, didn't get a chance to mention this. I would suspect that the Ukrainians still have a very Soviet conception the use of air power and what air superiority means. It's sort of my understanding broadly is that at an institutional level, they're very, very deeply steeped in the Soviet way of thinking, the Soviet terminology. My understanding is that's kind of been a bit of an issue trying to do some of the training and go between sort of, having personnel who are learned in the Western way of war, trying to translate that into Soviet speak for the Ukrainians. But in terms of what air superiority means to Ukraine, I think we need to. The first thing is to take a step back and realize that it's not going to be global, it's going to be local at absolute best. And superiority in this case likely really encompasses denial. And that is denial of, or greater denial of, Russia's ability to carry out missile raids with cruise missiles and one-way attack UAVs, the Shaheds, as well as to better, more effectively deny them the ability to employ glide bombs, the UMPKs and such. So it's less about actively gaining air superiority and using it to degrade enemy capabilities as would be conceived in sort of the Western way of thinking, and more so about denying the VKS the ability to use their rather significant material advantages to shape and affect the battle space in Russia's favor. It's about denying the ability to do that more than it is enabling Ukraine to leverage air power in a positive way for them to shape and enable offensive operations.
But that's true of everything. This whole war is just about denying Russia's ability to do things. I think it's true just across the board.
I would say, yeah, that's broadly correct. It's a theme, if you will.
I have a question to you, John, and it's about these radars and the difference in them and what it basically means for the Ukrainian Air Force. The upgrades, or these new modern radars, how much of a difference does it make for potential Ukrainian operators? Will they be able to, for instance, fly less aircraft to cover an area of operations, or will it just enhance the capability of actually being able to shoot down enemy aircraft?
Well, it depends on between what types of radar are you making this comparison? Okay, so Broadly speaking, there's three types of relevant radar here. There's mech scanned, mechanically scanned, which is, you can think of it as an array mounted on some sort of gimbal or mechanical actuation assembly that will pivot it left, right, up, down, etc. to steer the beam. And then you'll have a fixed array mounted on that assembly that just projects more or less a fixed cone of radio frequency emissions. And then that's typically what's currently on Ukrainian airframes. That's what's going to be on the F-16 they're receiving as we currently understand it. Moving beyond that, you have what are known as phased arrays, or I guess more fully electronically scanned arrays, and those fall into two categories: PISAs, passively electronically scanned arrays, and AESAs, actively electronically scanned arrays. And essentially what you can do there is, by some rather clever electrical engineering and radio frequency engineering, you can essentially you can generate a radio frequency beam and then steer it electronically, by delaying the phase at which you have a bunch of different individual tiny antenna elements emitting. So all those waves will interact and interfere with each other and either amplify or destroy each other depending on the ways in which they interact. And if you do all the math and you hook this up to a computer, you can basically have a fixed object that you can just electronically steer a beam around. And that's what you get for PISA and AESA. That confers a lot of benefits, namely range tends to be one. You tend to get a pretty significant range gain there. Your resolution tends to go up pretty considerably. Your ability to resolve smaller objects sees considerable growth. The beam gets much tighter. And one of the big things with AESA specifically is due to the fact that all of the individual antenna elements are hooked up to their own individual transmit receive modules. Individual antenna elements or groups of them can operate on different frequencies from the rest of the radar. You can have multiple independent beams. It's an incredible leap in capability. Like as I said, the Su-27s, the MiG-29s, those all have traditional mech scan radars. The F-16 MLUs, as they will currently be delivered, have APG-66 mech scan radars. The Gripen Cs, if delivered in their stock configuration, would have a mech scan radar. There is an active effort to retrofit them, though, with the PS whatever AESA. It isn't clear, if notionally, if Ukraine was to get Gripens, it isn't clear, if they would get Cs or Es, or if they get Cs, would they be ones with mech scan or AESAs? That's totally unknown. Then Gripen E just has by default an AESA radar system. Any mech scan that they get with the F-16s or the Gripens is going to be better than the MiG-29s and the Su-27s. The Soviet ones are bad. They're just bad. They're not good. The Western ones should be a decent bit better. Unfortunately, they still aren't all that good. They're very, very old, particularly the APG-66. That's just a marginally upgraded version of the original APG-66 that the F-16 originally shipped with in the 70s. The current radar arrangements that they would receive those aircraft with, they are not capable of sort of directly engaging VKS fixed wing assets on an even basis, in a vacuum, just for a moment set aside the ground-based air defense considerations, the electronic warfare, and all these other stuff that does actually matter in reality. Just on a one-for-one basis with the mech scan, they're still sort of hopelessly doomed in an engagement directly with, say, a Su-35, for example, or a MiG-31BM. There's ways around this. There is the APG-68, which is another mech scan radar that replaced the APG-66 in U.S. service. None of the European F-16 MLUs midlife updates ever got that. In theory, the U.S. Air Force should have a bunch of spare sets because we're currently going through and replacing our APG-68s with APG-83 AESAs across our F-16 fleet. So in theory, they could be upgraded, and that would place the F-16 MLUs on rather equal footing-ish, maybe slightly worse than the most modern Russian aircraft. Obviously, still a lot of factors go into shaping what would be a successful engagement, a lot of other considerations go into that than just radar performance. The big thing, though, is this will represent an improvement in Ukraine's ability to perform defensive counter-air against cruise missiles, one-way attack UAVs, again, the Shaheds, but it's still going to be a challenge. Non-AESA radars, and I won't comment on PISA because no Western aircraft uses those. That's kind of a Russian thing. We made the leap directly from MEXSCAN to AESA for the most part. The Russians are stuck with the passive arrays right now because their AESA tech is not, it's just not good. It's very immature compared to ours, at least as I understand it. But it's very difficult to do cruise missile defense with a MEXSCAN radar because cruise missiles are small. And to kind of give people some context for this, the reason why the U.S. retains F-117 Nighthawks, the world's first, operational very low observable aircraft, the reason why we retain those is because we use them to simulate cruise missiles. Cruise missiles are small. They have low radar cross sections. They are very difficult. They're a challenging threat from a signature perspective. So you really want an AESA to deal with those because they have so much greater ability to resolve really small objects at range compared to mech scans. So again, even though the APG-66 is better than the crap that's on the current Ukrainian MiG-29s and Su-27s, and the APG-68's, much better, it's still going to be a challenge. We're talking probably detection ranges. I'm just really roughly guessing here, probably like 35 or 30, 40 kilometers, somewhere in that range for a cruise missile, which is, it's not a lot, especially for a country the size of Ukraine. It's still going to be a very challenging mission set.
In terms of flying hours, do you think acquiring some of these new capabilities will extend the amount of flying hours you would have, or do they need to fly less? Is basically my question.
Well, no. I mean, they're doing what, like 30 sorties a day, which is kind of minuscule. They really want to get that number up. I would say that if they can really operationalize the F-16s, we want to see the flying hours go up compared to what we're seeing with the MiG-29s and the Su-27s, because they are not flying a lot right now. I suspect partially because many of those airframes are in really poor condition.
Ladin, is there anything you want to add before we go ahead to the next segment?
Yep, I just two thoughts quickly based on what John was saying, and maybe John can expand a little bit on it if he wants to. But some of the advantages of an electronically scanned radar, and in reference specifically to what you asked Arlen about, would they be able to? If I understood your question correctly from a few minutes ago, I think it was something like, would they be able to accomplish more with less aircraft? And with an AESA radar, you also have a great increase in track while scan capability, and the ability to track and engage multiple targets increases generally. Not that they're getting into any large dogfights with at visual or beyond visual range with the Russians right now, but it is mostly the mission against cruise missiles and drones. That's definitely, but also against the odd Su-34 that is lobbing guided bombs at them. That's more of a range issue. But they were definitely confident that, I think they are definitely confident that even the MLU F-16s will give them an advantage if you get into these more modern radars, more so. But given the fact that there's not going to be any Lend-Lease wave of aircraft arriving anytime soon, that's just not happening. They know very well they're not going to be able to swap their force out in 2024. So I can't imagine that if they understand that it's going to be limited numbers, that they're going to try to maximize what the capabilities of whatever they do get. And we've got pretty good indications that they've been pushing for that with F-16. What exactly it looks like, we don't know, and whether it's going anywhere, we don't know. But they've got to be having those discussions with other potential sources as well.
Yeah, that's basically my question. If they could do more with less, because I kind of get the feeling that there's going to be a limited amount of aircraft arriving to Ukraine in the short to medium term, and we can't really expect Ukraine's capabilities in this field to greatly enhance. So when it comes to flying hours and sorties per day, that's kind of the feeling I have.
So, Alan, I saw like 2 questions in chat before we wrap the segment, if that's okay. Is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I think the first one's pretty straightforward from Kellen Dunn. Like, when do you think F-16s will realistically be in theater operating in Ukraine, and what's the minimum number that like you would see as some kind of an effective force to be actually used in operations? And the second one is, I'm going to rephrase it a bit, but Theory asks, could F-16 capabilities be replaced by things like long-range missiles? I think maybe I'll relate that to say, what are the unique capabilities that a fixed-wing airframe can provide that other platforms can't? Maybe that's a good way to put it. Yeah, Latin.
If we're talking about a comparison with surface-to-air missiles, then as far as I know, the big in that counter-air role, the big advantage is that it's far more mobile. It's able to move around much more quickly and maybe fill in some of the gaps in the ground-based air defense, which is less mobile generally. And as far as the number of F-16s, I think there was a two-part question there about when. I mean, that is the million-dollar question. I don't know the exact date of initial operational capability. We probably know better now, have a better idea than we did a few months ago. It's looking like probably late first quarter or into the second quarter of this year. That's what I'm putting together from what I'm hearing. And IOC is going to be a relatively small number of aircraft. It's going to be no more. I can't see it being much more initially than a Ukrainian squadron. So about 12 aircraft, maybe some spares, maybe, as I said, maybe even an understrength squadron. And since the primary tasking, I think initially will be that air defense against drones and cruise missiles, and probably against Russian tactical aircraft launching the glide bombs. I think the Ukrainians are probably pretty confident of being able to have some impact in those areas with a relatively small number of aircraft. Really having an impact on the ground war, because that's probably, in my guess, slightly less of a. They're both great priorities, but the defense against these cruise missile and other missile attacks and drones is probably still the number one priority. That makes it less likely that they're going to be involved in the air to ground. And the air to ground is something that really depends as well. We know we have a pretty good idea what they're going to be equipped with in terms of missiles in the air to air role, but in the air to ground, we really don't know. I know John's done quite a bit of work and analysis of what American systems with those F-16s could make a real impact on ground targets, on taking out Russian ground targets. But as far as I know, we have very little indication of what new might arrive with those F-16s. We know that JDAM is plug and play with the F-16, but not so much the Scalp. I think there would have to be some Scalp and Storm Shadow. There'd have to be some, but there are American equivalents to that I know John's mentioned before.
Yeah, there's a wide variety of options from the U.S. standpoint. There's JASSM, there's SLAM-ER, which would require integration work. There's a panoply of air-to-surface munitions that are available. We don't really know what any of them are going to be besides JDAM, which they already have, and besides HARM, which they already have, and besides in terms of air-to-air, besides Sidewinder and AirMAN, both of which they already have. The rest is just sort of totally unknown at this point. And I would say, in terms of what F-16s bring to the table, or really any fixed wing platform, is Latin obviously covered kind of the air defense standpoint, but from the more offensive standpoint, there's a lot of value in some cases from having a 500-pound bomb available rather than a 155 millimeter shell. They certainly won't get the type of value from fixed wing platforms that, say, the U.S. Air Force or any other NATO member would, just because they aren't able to effectively neutralize the VKS and Russian ground-based air defenses like we can. But even so, I mean, just having, more JDAMs available along the front line, pave way potentially some of these other systems, small diameter bombs, access to harm targeting system for harm, ARGM potentially, all of these things. They push the envelope a little bit further in Ukraine's favor in a tactical and arguably operational sense, depending on the context and the mission set.
Before we end the aviation segment, John and Latin, do you want to spare a quick comment on the A-10s that Oleshuk brought up?
What I'll briefly say is, listen, it's already a struggle to get the F-16s from the U.S. Well, what drawdown authority are the A-10s going to come from? What funding pool? What account? USAI or replenishment or any of these FNF? Where is the sustainment funding going to come from the A-10s? And what else is going to have to get cut to support that? What tanks won't they get? What Bradleys won't they get? What shells won't they get for them to get A-10s?
Yeah.
Yeah, from that political point of view, it could easily be just a non-starter. It could indicate a little bit of that kind of bias that you were talking about earlier, John. The fact that this came up again, that Soviet doctrine that is probably really baked into even some of the relatively younger officers, where, as I always understood it, in Soviet aviation, there was great emphasis on fixed wing being existing for the support of the army. That doesn't necessarily mean strictly close air support, but that they operate as operate primarily to facilitate what the army is doing. In the West, we moved kind of beyond that, especially after post Cold War, with the Air Force being a very active part, a very critical part of offensive operations. So I don't know if that's kind of if they're seeing it simply as, well, it's the American equivalent of the Su-25 and our Su-25s are in pretty bad shape. It might have been that simple, but they do know the aircraft, they've seen it, and they, at the very least, I think they're thinking of it as something that has a big, thick wing, just like the Su-25. It can carry a lot of rockets. We want to be able to continue doing some of those operations with unguided rockets against Russian ground targets, and they may simply see it as that, based on the fact that their Su-25 force may be in a real critical state right now. But like as John said, so much of this depends on American policy, be it just a total non-starter.
Thank you very much, Latin and John. I think I'm going to pass the word back to Joseph. I'm just going to finish off with this F-16 with a bunch of different munitions. I think it's pretty outdated, but yeah, hopefully we'll see that in Ukraine soon.